Power is not something that vanishes in a single moment of defeat. It is a quiet thief that moves invisibly, seeping into the edges of your life in ways so subtle that you do not even recognize the theft until it has already stripped you bare. And most men never see it coming because they mistake small concessions, minor gestures, and habitual behaviors for normalcy, for kindness, for humility, when in reality they are the secret fractures that define whether you command respect or invite exploitation. The irony is that these leaks feel natural, even polite, almost unavoidable, yet their cumulative effect is devastating. For every sigh before speaking, every nervous laugh, every over-explained decision, every habit of softening your voice when tension rises, every nod you offer to avoid confrontation, and every smile that does not reach your eyes is a deposit in the account of your own diminishment, teaching the world how to treat you long before you consciously realize it. And by the time you notice that people no longer defer to your authority, that your presence no longer shapes a room, it is far too late to reclaim what has already been surrendered piece by piece, because power is not stolen in dramatic moments. It dies quietly in the private spaces of your mind and body, in the unnoticed patterns of over-explanation, in the compulsive need to justify yourself to anyone who asks, in the compulsive habit of seeking approval where none is required, and in the subtle ways you bend your presence to soothe the imagined discomfort of others. And it begins with one of the most socially acceptable yet destructive behaviors of all, over-explaining. For when you justify your decisions, your boundaries, your preferences, or your choices, you do not communicate clarity. You reveal doubt, insecurity, and a subtle tremor beneath the tone of your voice that tells the world, without words, that you are negotiable, that your stance is pliable, and that your authority is optional. And once someone senses this tremor, they no longer see you as decisive. They see you as malleable, someone whose space, whose time, whose boundaries, and whose very sense of self can be influenced if pressed hard enough. And this is how psychological predators, manipulators, and opportunists find their prey, not because you are outwardly weak, but because you have quietly signaled weakness. Because every nervous laugh, every sigh, every unnecessary explanation, and every preemptive apology is a map to your limits, a blueprint for how to manage, bend, or undermine you without confrontation. And most men fail to notice this because they have been conditioned to believe that politeness and accommodation are moral virtues, when in fact they are often the instruments of their own subjugation, and over-explaining is only the first leak, the smallest, quietest, and most socially acceptable, yet it is the doorway to far greater losses. For once you reveal that your presence requires validation, the room shifts subtly around you, people adjust their behavior unconsciously, and a hierarchy forms in which you are predictably malleable, and this cascade of surrender continues with the next habitual concession, the smile that does not reach your eyes, the nod that signals agreement to something you do not accept, the laugh meant to soften tension but in reality reveals submission. For people do not watch your words as much as they watch your face, your body, your micro-expressions. And when your expressions are calibrated to reassure rather than assert, when your body moves to accommodate instead of occupy space, the world interprets this as permission to test limits, to push boundaries, and to influence outcomes without your conscious consent. And it is in these private, automated behaviors that the greatest power drains occur, because every subtle act of appeasement, every reflexive attempt to be agreeable, to avoid conflict or to seem harmless trains others to expect compliance, and these expectations become leverage over you without your awareness. And yet even this is only the beginning, because alongside over-explaining and appeasing expressions, there exists a more insidious internal pattern, one so familiar, so normalized, so invisible, that most men carry it their entire lives without recognizing it for what it is. The silent doctrine of external dependence, the subconscious belief that power exists outside of oneself, that it is measured by how others treat you, that it is given by others and must be maintained by approval, and once this belief takes root, it structures the entire psychology of a man, so that every thought, every habit, every gesture, every decision, and every emotional response is filtered through the imagined judgment of others, producing hesitation where action is required, doubt where certainty should reign, and self-erasure where presence should dominate, so that even when a man occupies a room, speaks his mind, or asserts a boundary, he does so tentatively, unconsciously seeking validation for the very act of existence, and this internal dependency corrupts the most basic aspects of social power, from the posture of the body to the rhythm of movement, the tone of voice, the breadth of gaze, the weight of decision, and the internal alignment with one's own reality. For the man who believes that his influence is granted externally, constantly monitors himself as if under scrutiny by an invisible jury, rehearsing gestures, overthinking speech, predicting reactions, softening expression, and in doing so, he betrays his instinctive authority, erodes his confidence, and signals weakness without ever intending to, and these internal betrayals compound over time, creating a habitual architecture of subordination, where even when he appears confident, his body retracts subtly, shoulders roll forward, spine curves, gaze drops, hands fidget, breaths become shallow, legs cross defensively, weight shifts backward unconsciously, and every step and motion communicates submission long before words are spoken. And the world reads these signals instinctively because humans are biologically wired to decode posture, micro-expressions, and subtle movement as information about hierarchy, dominance, and vulnerability, and the man who collapses unconsciously toward the world, who shrinks in presence, who bends to accommodate, signals immediately that he does not occupy the space he deserves, that his internal authority is negotiable, and that his power is not self-generated, and once this is internalized by observers, the dynamic shifts irreversibly. People speak differently, they move differently, they test limits unconsciously, they push boundaries that would not exist with a man whose posture, expression, and micro-behavior radiate self-possession, and even beyond these external and internal manifestations, there exists the domain of emotional leakage, perhaps the most immediate and dangerous erosion of power. For the man who allows his emotional state to reveal itself before he processes, it becomes entirely predictable, entirely readable, entirely manipulable. And when annoyance, irritation, fear, or uncertainty appear in his face or gestures, the world does not perceive it as authenticity. It perceives it as weakness. And manipulators, predators, and even ordinary people attuned to dominance detect these signals instantly, pressing just enough to provoke a response, testing boundaries, exploiting hesitation, and converting subtle emotional honesty into leverage. And this emotional susceptibility compounds the damage of over-explaining, appeasing, and collapsing posture because it adds another layer of predictability and malleability, producing a feedback loop in which external dependence, physical contraction, social appeasement, and emotional overexposure all feed into one another, amplifying vulnerability and reducing influence. And yet most men never see it, because the habit of projecting others' judgment onto themselves has been normalized, celebrated even, as humility, self-awareness, or diplomacy, when in truth it is psychological self-sabotage. And the culmination of these leaks is the ultimate belief that power is external, that one must negotiate, explain, appease, adjust, and perform for validation, when in reality power is internal, generated, self-recognized. And the moment a man internalizes this truth, every prior leak begins to close naturally. Over-explaining ceases, nervous smiles vanish. Emotional leakage stops, posture strengthens, gaze sharpens, decisions crystallize, and presence becomes thick, gravitational, undeniable. And until that realization is achieved, Every habit, every reflex, every posture, every expression, every thought aligned with imagined judgment erodes authority incrementally yet relentlessly, shaping a life in which submission is second nature, scission is of nature. So, opportunity is rare, influence is limited, and potential remains untapped. And the cruelest irony is that this erosion occurs silently, invisibly, in private, in habitual micro-leaks, in gestures unnoticed by oneself, but read with immediate clarity by everyone else. And when you consider the man who habitually softens his voice, over-explains his decisions, smiles to cover discomfort, mirrors emotions to avoid conflict, collapses physically when tension arises, or reacts emotionally before reasoning can process events, you see not weakness in the conventional sense, but the systematic surrender of authority to everyone around him, an authority he could never reclaim without first addressing the root belief that power is external, that validation is owed, and that influence is a permission granted rather than a state recognized. And this belief, the silent doctrine shaping his thoughts, habits, and gestures, is the final most dangerous corrosion of all, because it infects everything: speech, expression, posture, breathing, presence, decision-making, and emotional alignment, creating a man whose life orbits the approval of others, whose existence depends on their, whose authority is a reflection of their judgment rather than the product of his own internal framework. And until he dismantles this doctrine, understands that power originates within, and begins to inhabit his own authority, he will continue leaking influence in every interaction, unaware, unnoticed, quietly surrendering dominance in 1,000 small, polite, socially accepted ways that cumulatively erase his presence from the hierarchy he imagines he occupies. The moment a man internalizes that power is his own, that it is generated from within rather than granted by others, an entirely new architecture of presence begins to form, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but profoundly transformative, because every habit, every reflex, every posture, every micro-expression, every word, and every breath that previously whispered submission now shifts into alignment with internal authority. And this shift does not manifest through force, exaggeration, or performative gestures. It manifests quietly, invisibly, through internal recalibration that externalizes itself naturally, organically, so that confidence ceases to be an act and becomes a state. And a man in this state does not over-explain because he no longer seeks approval. He does not apologize for being present because he no longer fears judgment. He does not overreact emotionally because he no longer grants his power to the whims of perceived threat. And he does not collapse physically because his body has learned to inhabit its space from a foundation of internal certainty rather than external permission. And the ripple effect of this internal sovereignty is immediate. His gaze becomes steady, not threatening, but unavoidable. His posture becomes strong without effort, commanding without display. His movements are deliberate, not hurried, not reactive, not performative. His voice carries weight without raising volume, and his decisions arrive with finality, not because they are defended or justified, but because they are rooted in a certainty that needs no confirmation, a certainty that radiates like gravity and shifts the behavior of everyone around him unconsciously. For humans are wired to respond to presence, to internalized authority, to subtle signals that communicate dominance, stability, and self-possession, and this is why the man who masters himself, who internalizes that power originates within, is nearly untouchable. For he becomes a node around which the social fabric of any room reorganizes itself, a silent force that redefines expectations, sets boundaries without announcement, and ensures that his influence is recognized without debate. Yet this transformation is not sudden. It is the product of conscious excavation of every internalized habit, every unconscious concession, every pattern of submission, and every belief that power is external, because the mind-body And emotional systems have been conditioned for years to operate as if influence must be negotiated rather than enacted, and so the man must first dismantle these automatic processes, rewiring thought patterns, retraining posture, controlling breath, and mastering emotional responses until each micro-movement and instinctive reaction aligns with the recognition that authority is self-generated, and the psychological liberation that follows is profound. He no longer interprets silence as disapproval. He no longer assumes judgment where there is none. He no longer overcorrects. He no longer shrinks. He no longer mirrors unnecessarily, and he no longer permits himself to be moved by imagined criticism, because the locus of evaluation has shifted from the external to the internal, and this shift rewrites the entire dynamic of human interaction. For a man who moves from internal authority, commands attention without effort, directs conversations without raising his voice, and dictates social tempo without announcing his intentions, because his presence itself signals certainty, strength, and inevitability, and the difference between him and the man who remains dependent on external validation is immediately palpable to anyone who enters the room. One is a center of gravity, the other a satellite. One radiates alignment and control, the other radiates tension and concession. One sets the frame, the other reacts within it, and this difference determines whether his life is filled with opportunity or constrained by limitation, whether he influences or is influenced, whether he is followed or overlooked, because social hierarchies, whether in business, relationships, or public life, respond to the internal signals of authority rather than the loud proclamations of intent, and a man who has mastered this understands that every glance, every gesture, every pause, every micro-expression, and every breath communicates more than 1,000 words, and that mastery over these subtleties, when coupled with the internal belief that power is his own, produces a presence so compelling that others cannot help but recalibrate around him. And the paradox is that the more he stops performing, the more influence he exerts, because true authority is recognized, not argued, earned, not demanded, and this is why over-explaining disappears naturally when internal authority is assumed, why nervous smiles vanish, why reactive emotional leakage ceases, why collapsing posture strengthens, why breath slows and deepens, and why the man becomes someone whose decisions, actions, and presence are not questioned, not because he compels compliance, but because he inhabits a state of being that communicates clarity, certainty, and self-possession. And the practical consequences of this mastery are observable in every interaction. Colleagues stop attempting to control him, subordinates naturally defer, peers adjust without conflict, opponents hesitate because the dynamic itself has shifted, and manipulators no longer recognize pathways to influence because the map they relied upon, the map of over-explanations, appeasing expressions, emotional reactions, and collapsed posture has been erased, replaced with an internal frame so robust that it anchors behavior independently of external circumstance. And this is why the most powerful men, the ones who shape outcomes effortlessly and command presence without theater, rarely raise their voice, rarely perform, rarely negotiate for approval, because every action is born from a state of certainty that operates faster, more efficiently, and more dominantly than any conscious calculation could. And while this might appear natural or effortless to the observer, it is the result of rigorous internal discipline, repeated awareness, and deliberate cultivation of autonomy. For the mind must be trained to resist external judgment. The body must be trained to inhabit space confidently, even when unobserved. And the emotional system must be trained to process stimuli internally rather than reveal them externally, until this triad, mental, physical, emotional, aligns in an integrated system, and presence becomes a function of internal authority rather than external reception. And yet, the power gained through internalization is not brute force. It is quiet, deliberate, and nuanced, and it is almost invisible until observed in contrast with the reactive, appeasing, and externally dependent men who populate the world, and the contrast is unmistakable. For the man whose power is internal moves like a river carving terrain, shaping outcomes subtly but irrevocably, while the man who seeks external validation moves like a boat buffeted by every wave, directionless, reactive, and at the mercy of forces he believes are outside his control. And this is the ultimate lesson in the psychology of authority. The world never grants power, it only recognizes it, and the recognition comes only after the man has first claimed it internally. And when he does, the leaks that once drained him vanish naturally, because over-explanation is no longer necessary. When one acts decisively, nervous smiles are no longer needed when one is unmoved. Emotional leakage ceases when one controls the internal state before external reaction. Collapsed posture disappears when the body inhabits its own space, and hesitation gives way to fluid, confident action. And the final irony is that this transformation does not require anyone else's permission, observation, or approval, because the locus of power has shifted irreversibly from the outside world to the self. And once a man has realized this, every room becomes his to navigate, every interaction an opportunity to project authority rather than negotiate for relevance, every decision a statement of presence rather than a plea for acknowledgement, and the social world adjusts instinctively to the internal architecture of his power, because humans respond instinctively to signals of certainty, presence, and alignment, and the internal shift manifests physically in the way he moves, gait measured and grounded, shoulders relaxed yet firm, spine aligned, breath steady, hands relaxed, gaze unwavering, pauses deliberate, tone weighted without effort, choices executed decisively, and reactions tempered with control. And socially, in every conversation, he exerts influence without appearing to do so, because influence is now the product of the internal state rather than external negotiation, and psychologically, he no longer orbits others, no longer seeks approval, no longer betrays his instincts, no longer defers, no longer mirrors unnecessarily, no longer reacts emotionally before reasoning, no longer collapses physically, no longer over-explains, and no longer softens presence to appease the imagined judgment of others, because he has internalized that his power originates within, and as a result, the external world recognizes it automatically, unconsciously, in the posture of his body, the weight of his decisions, the stillness in his gaze, the calmness of his emotions, and the inevitability of his presence. And this is the apex of the psychological architecture of authority. For no act of persuasion, no force of charisma, no volume of speech, no theatrical gesture, no attempt at performance can compare to the gravity of a man who inhabits his own power from the inside out, whose every movement, breath, glance, word, and decision radiates the internal certainty that creates influence naturally, effortlessly, invisibly, irrevocably. And until a man reaches this state, he is leaking power silently in thousands of private, automated ways, his potential siphoned away by over-explanation, appeasing expressions, emotional reactivity, collapsed posture, external dependency, and habitual submission. But the moment he internalizes his authority, all of these leaks stop naturally, because his mind, body, and emotional system are no longer instruments of external negotiation, but rather instruments of internal sovereignty, and the shift is so profound that it rewrites the way he occupies space, perceives reality, interacts with others, and moves through the world. And the final lesson is simple yet terrifyingly ignored. Power is never granted, it is always claimed, and the first claim begins within before any room is entered, any conversation begun, any action taken, and until that claim is made, men will continue leaking influence in ways that are invisible to themselves but instantly readable by everyone else. And the day a man finally stops giving his power away, he ceases to be prey, he ceases to orbit, he ceases to react, and he becomes a force the world must acknowledge, a gravitational center, a quiet authority, an internalized presence so complete that the social fabric bends around him automatically, and all the small habits that once drained him, over-explaining, appeasing, emotional leakage, collapsed posture, nervous gestures, vanish because they are no longer necessary, replaced by a new physiology, a new psychology, a new method of inhabiting space and presence. And this is why the cultivation of internal authority is not optional for any man who wishes to influence, to command, or to leave an imprint on the world, because the alternative is invisibility, submission, orbiting, and the quiet erosion of potential that occurs not in the public eye, but in the silent privacy of habits, gestures, reactions, and beliefs misaligned with self-generated power. And once a man understands this, the final question remains, the one question that determines whether he will live as a participant in someone else's hierarchy or as the author of his own. Will you claim your power internally, recognize that it originates from within, and stop surrendering it through private, habitual, unconscious behaviors, or will you continue leaking authority little by little, silently, unknowingly, until the world has read your weakness and you find yourself orbiting, invisible, and irrelevant despite every act of effort, politeness, and good intention?